Look around you for a second. The device you're using to watch this, the coffee you drank this morning, the news you're scrolling through, none of it belongs to just one country anymore. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to completely unpack the massive, interconnected systems that shape our modern world. Today, we're diving deep into two concepts that absolutely define the 21st century: globalization and the urgent growing call for global justice. We have a seriously packed agenda today. We'll be hitting 1. The mechanics of globalization. 2. Impacts and dimensions. 3. The Indian experience. 4. The need for global justice. 5. Perspectives on global justice. And finally, 6. Achieving an equitable world. We are funneling from the broad mechanics of our global system all the way down to a specific real-world case study, and then ending with the moral frameworks we need to make sense of it all. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The mechanics of globalization. Before we can really dig into how this impacts our lives, we have to establish exactly what is driving all this global interconnectedness. Okay, so the absolute crucial point here is that globalization allows for the free flow of goods, services, capital, and information across borders. But let's actually paint a picture of what that means in reality. Think about your smartphone. It might be designed by software engineers in California, right? But then it's assembled in a massive factory in China, using raw materials like cobalt that was mined in Africa, and then finally sold in a storefront in Europe. That is globalization in action. It's this incredibly multifaceted process that essentially shrinks the world. And what's really accelerating this whole phenomenon? Well, it's massive advancements in technology and transportation. We went from steamships to cargo planes, and from telegraphs to fiber optic cables pulsing with terabytes of data every single second. These are the literal engines making it easier, faster, and much cheaper for people and businesses to connect globally. And in doing so, they've created a deep, inescapable interdependence between countries that we have literally never seen before in human history. Section 2. Impacts and dimensions. Now that we have our baseline established, let's explore how these mechanics actually reshape our daily lives across different spheres of society. The duality of globalization is just fascinating because massive opportunities are sitting right alongside some very serious challenges. Let's break down the economic dimension first. Yes, businesses get to expand into exciting new markets and attract foreign investment, which optimizes their profits. But, while a multinational corporation can save millions by moving its manufacturing overseas to where labor's cheaper, the factory town they leave behind often faces devastating job losses and total economic stagnation. Then, politically, nations are essentially forced to cooperate on massive existential issues like climate change and international security. Yet, at the exact same time, they face deep concerns over their own national sovereignty. I mean, how much power does a government really hold when a multinational tech or energy corporation has more wealth and influence than the country itself? And socially, it's just as complex. We get this beautiful cultural exchange. You can enjoy authentic international cuisine in almost any major city and easily connect with communities globally. But we also face rising social inequality, where the benefits of this global economy just get funneled to the top, while local communities fear their unique cultural identities are being washed away. Section 3. The Indian experience. To really ground these somewhat abstract concepts, we need to look at a powerful, real-world case study of these global forces in action. Take India, for example. Back in 1991, India made a pivotal decision to liberalize its economy, and the transformation that followed was simply staggering. By opening its doors and tearing down strict trade barriers, India attracted an absolute flood of foreign direct investment. This influx of capital allowed the country to leapfrog in specific technological sectors. All through the 90s and 2000s, this created a massive, unprecedented IT boom. It lifted millions of people into a rapidly growing middle class and turned domestic companies into absolute global powerhouses that now provide software services worldwide. Hubs like Bangalore completely transformed into global tech capitals. And today we see the massive cultural ripple effect, where Bollywood films, Indian music, and actors have gained immense international fame, drastically enhancing India's cultural soft power on the world stage. However, we have to look at the whole picture, because this massive growth tells only half the story. While global integration created undeniable, life-changing opportunities, like the establishment of special economic zones designed to provide favorable tax conditions and attract even more international business, it simultaneously caused real pain in other sectors. The exact same globalization that built that booming IT sector heavily challenged traditional agriculture. Imagine being a local small-scale farmer who suddenly has to face fierce competition from heavily subsidized, mass-produced global imports. When cheap imported goods flood a market, local manufacturing and agricultural sectors naturally contract. That leaves millions of traditional workers really struggling to survive in a newly globalized marketplace. We see a similar, deeply complex tension happening socially too. There is this amazing cultural export happening. Indian cuisine, yoga, and cinema are incredibly beloved in almost every corner of the globe. But this is carefully balanced against the reality of what sociologists call cultural homogenization. In India, the heavy influence of Western corporate and pop culture is highly evident in everything from fast food consumption to fashion and entertainment. It raises some very real, valid concerns about cultural homogenization. The fear that deeply rooted indigenous traditions, languages, and customs might be overshadowed or even eventually replaced by a standardized, mass-produced global culture. Furthermore, while the major urban centers have seen skyrocketing living standards and job creation, rural areas frequently lag way behind, which just exacerbates a painful domestic social inequality. Section 4, the need for global justice. So, given these incredibly stark inequalities between urban and rural and between developed and developing nations, how do we actually course correct? To address the profound flaws of globalization, we really need a new moral framework. Traditionally, the concept of justice basically stops at a country's borders. You pay your taxes, and in return, your local government builds roads, schools, and maintains order in your specific community. Simple, right? But global justice completely challenges this. It asks a profound question. If our economies, our supply chains, and our environmental impacts are absolutely no longer bound by borders, should our moral responsibilities be bounded by them? Because our world is now characterized by extreme disparities, where some nations enjoy incredible excess while others lack basic sanitation, this concept demands we look at inequalities on a worldwide scale. When a financial crisis in one hemisphere crashes markets in another, our responsibilities to one another absolutely have to evolve. This brings us to the concept of moral responsibility, which is incredibly well articulated by the philosopher Peter Singer. His famous drowning child analogy is easily one of the most powerful thought experiments in modern ethics. Imagine you're walking to work wearing a brand new, very expensive pair of shoes. You pass the shallow pond and you see a small child drowning. Singer points out that you would instantly wade into that muddy water to save the child, even though it would completely ruin your expensive shoes. Why? Because the cost to you, a pair of shoes, is entirely negligible compared to the profound moral importance of a human life. Singer then makes this brilliant leap. He argues that distance, whether that child is 10 feet away in a pond or 10,000 miles away starving in a developing nation, does not alter your moral obligation to save a life when the cost to you is minimal. Basically, those who are better off in the global system have a strict moral obligation to assist those in need, entirely regardless of geography. Section 5, Perspectives on Global Justice. Okay, so we know we have a responsibility, but how do we actually structure this fairness? Let's dive in. These 3 pillars form the absolute core of global justice. First, distributive justice. This asks the hard, logistical questions about how wealth, natural resources, and economic opportunities should actually be allocated among countries to prevent extreme poverty. Next, human rights. This asserts that everyone, simply by being human, has inherent universal rights that aren't merely granted by a state, but belong to them wherever they happen to be born. And finally, cosmopolitanism, which is the underlying philosophical approach here. It explicitly views humanity as a single, unified community. It basically argues that your nationality is just a random accident of birth, and therefore, every single individual is a global citizen first, with moral obligations extending to everyone else on the planet. Now, globally, scholars approach the execution of these pillars quite differently, and it's super interesting to compare them. Think of John Rawls as taking a bit more of a moderate approach. In his work, he argued that we must respect state sovereignty, meaning countries should be allowed to govern themselves. But the international community has to ensure those states adhere to principles that promote basic human rights. Then you have Charles Bates, who focuses heavily on resources. He argues that it's fundamentally unjust for a country to be destitute simply because they don't happen to have oil or fertile soil within their arbitrary borders. He believes natural resources should be allocated fairly so all societies can meet their basic needs. And finally, cosmopolitan theories are the most radical departure from tradition. They push for a purely universalist approach, where individual human rights always completely transcend and override state interests and borders. Let's look at how a specific nation approaches these frameworks in practice. India's unique perspective is deeply influenced by its historical context, specifically centuries of colonialism. Because of this, India strongly advocates for a development-oriented approach to justice. They argue that global economic growth must actually be inclusive, specifically benefiting the global south, not just further enriching the global north. We see this brilliantly illustrated in their stance on climate justice. India points out the historical responsibility of climate change. Western nations industrialized and polluted freely for over a century to build their massive wealth. So India argues it's highly unjust for those same wealthy nations to now demand developing countries strictly halt their own economic growth and emissions without offering significant financial and technological support to actually help them transition. Section 6. Achieving an Equitable World. Moving from these philosophical frameworks out into the real world, what does this actually look like in practice? We are actually seeing global justice initiatives being attempted right now. Look at global health during the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVAX initiative was designed specifically to pool global resources and ensure that all countries had equitable access to vaccines, proving that life-saving healthcare shouldn't just be a privilege for the highest bidder. The Paris Agreement is another great example. It operates on a really important principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. That basically means everyone has to fight climate change, but it formally recognizes that wealthy developed nations have a greater historical burden and way more financial capability to lead the charge than developing nations do. And fair trade movements actively work to bypass exploitative middlemen in the global supply chain, ensuring that the actual local farmers and producers in developing countries receive fair, equitable compensation for their coffee, cocoa, and textiles. These frameworks and real-world initiatives show us something absolutely vital. While globalization has inextricably linked our economies, our technologies, and our cultures, it's global justice that forces us to link our morals. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, crucial thought to chew on. Given our deep, completely unavoidable interdependence and the clear disparities that exist between nations today, in a fully connected world, where exactly do you draw the line on your own moral obligations?